The Last Ride. João Silva, a 45-year-old taxi driver, had been working the night shifts in São Paulo for 2 decades. His life was a monotonous routine until that rainy Friday in March. Around 11 p.m., João picked up a passenger in the city center. The woman, dressed entirely in black, had skin pale as wax and deeply dark eyes. She entered the taxi silently and whispered an address in the distant neighborhood of Parelheiros. During the trip, João tried to make conversation, but the woman remained silent. Looking through the rearview mirror, he noticed something disturbing. The passenger had no reflection. He felt a chill run down his spine, but tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. As they moved away from the center, the streets grew darker and more deserted. João began to hear whispers coming from the back seat, although the woman did not move her lips. The air inside the car turned cold, and João saw his breath condense. Upon reaching the destination, a dilapidated Victorian house, the woman simply disappeared. Trembling, João sped back to the city. In the days that followed, João was tormented by vivid nightmares. He saw the woman everywhere, in the mirror, in the shadows of his room, in the back seat of his taxi. His wife, concerned, noticed he woke up screaming every night. Desperate, João returned to the abandoned house. Talking to neighbors, he discovered a terrible story. In 1954, a young woman named Maria Luisa was brutally murdered there. The description matched his mysterious passenger exactly. João sought help from Dona Zulmira, a well-known medium. In a chilling session, Maria Luisa's spirit manifested, accusing João of being the reincarnation of her killer. To break the curse, he needed to uncover the truth about the crime and bring justice. Obsessed, João dove into a dangerous investigation. He combed through old records, talked to elderly locals, and gradually pieced together the puzzle. The killer was Antonio Ferreira, a powerful businessman, now 90 years old. When João confronted Antonio at his mansion, the old man confessed to the crime but swore revenge. That night, João was attacked by Antonio's henchmen. Injured, he managed to escape to the abandoned house. There, in a terrifying climax, João found himself cornered between the armed henchmen and the vengeful spirit of Maria Luisa. At the last moment, he convinced the spirit of his innocence. Maria Luisa, finally understanding the truth, turned against Antonio and his men. The police arrived to find Antonio confessing in tears, apparently driven mad by terror. João was saved, but forever changed by the experience. In the following years, passengers occasionally reported seeing a young woman dressed in black in the back seat of João's taxi, smiling serenely before disappearing into the night. The case of Maria Luisa's murder was reopened, and Antonio Ferreira was finally convicted of his crime. João thought he could return to his normal life, but soon realized his connection to the supernatural world was far from over. In the ensuing weeks, João began to notice subtle changes in his taxi. The radio would turn on by itself, tuning to stations that played only static or 1950s music. The speedometer sometimes spun wildly, even when the car was parked. And most disturbingly, dark stains began appearing on the back seat, resembling the shape of a seated person. His fellow taxi drivers started avoiding him, whispering that his car was E-marked. Passengers complained of strange sensations during rides, sudden chills, the feeling of being watched, or even sensing someone sitting beside them in the empty seat. One night, João picked up an elderly passenger who, during the trip, began talking about the e-portals that existed in the city. Places where the veil between the world of the living and the dead was thinner. To João's horror, he realized that Maria Luisa's house was one of those places. Disturbed, João sought out Dona Zulmira again. The medium revealed that by helping Maria Luisa find peace, João had inadvertently become a beacon for other lost spirits. His taxi was now a vehicle between two worlds, attracting souls seeking to resolve unfinished business. João found himself entangled in a series of supernatural cases. Each ghostly passenger brought with them a tragic story and a mystery to be solved. There was the spirit of a World War II soldier, seeking to deliver a final letter to his beloved. A lost child, a victim of a traffic accident decades ago, wanting one last hug from her mother. An old musician, wishing to play his final composition. As João helped these spirits, his reputation in São Paulo's supernatural underworld grew. He became known as the taxi driver of souls, feared by some, sought after by others. But each resolved case took its toll. João began to age rapidly, his hair turning white, deep wrinkles marking his face. His wife left him, unable to cope with the strangeness that now permeated his life. João knew he couldn't continue like this forever. He needed to find a way to close the portal he had unintentionally opened, or risk being completely consumed by the world of the dead. His quest led him to ancient rituals, urban shamans, and hidden secrets in the dark alleys of the city. But the deeper he delved, the more dangerous his path became. Malevolent entities, attracted by his unique ability, began to pursue him. Now, João drives through the streets of São Paulo every night, never knowing if his next passenger will be among the living or the dead, always searching for a way to end his final ride. João's search for a solution took him to increasingly dark places in the city. On a particularly foggy night, he was guided by a mysterious passenger to an old abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of São Paulo. There, João found a secret circle of mediums and occultists who gathered at midnight. They revealed that his condition was known as the Mark of Sharon, a reference to the mythological ferryman who transported souls across the river Styx. The leader of the group, a blind man named Ezekiel, explained that the only way for João to free himself was to complete a series of tasks to balance the energies between the worlds. Each task would require João to face one of his greatest fears and make a personal sacrifice. The first mission took João back to the house where Maria Luisa was murdered. He had to spend an entire night there, reliving the horror of the crime through the eyes of the victim. The visions were so vivid and terrifying that João nearly went insane. The second task made him confront the vengeful spirit of a serial killer executed decades ago. João had to use his empathy to understand the monster without succumbing to his malevolent influence. This challenge tested the limits of his compassion and nearly corrupted his soul. For the third trial, João was forced to relive the most traumatic moment of his own life, the car accident that killed his parents when he was a child. He had to come to terms not only with the loss, but also with the guilt he carried for having survived. Each challenge left João more physically and emotionally exhausted. His body was deteriorating rapidly, as if aging years in a matter of days. But he knew he couldn't stop. The final task was the most dangerous. João had to travel to the threshold between the worlds of the living and the dead. Using an ancient ritual taught by Ezekiel, he entered a near-death state. In this shadowy realm between worlds, João found himself in a distorted and sinister version of São Paulo. The streets were paved with bones, the buildings made of whispering shadows. Here, he had to find and confront the entity that had initially marked him. The entity revealed itself as an ancient and powerful being that fed on the suffering of lost souls. It had chosen João as its new collector of souls, a role he had unconsciously assumed when helping Maria Luisa. João realized he couldn't defeat the entity by force. Instead, he offered a deal. He would continue to help lost souls, but on his own terms, guiding them to the light rather than delivering them to darkness. After a tense negotiation that seemed to last an eternity, the entity accepted, recognizing João's compassion as a powerful force in itself. João awoke in his taxi, parked at the cemetery. Ezekiel and the others had vanished. He felt that something fundamental had changed. The Mark of Sharon was still with him, but now it was a power he controlled, not a curse that controlled him. In the years that followed, João continued his work as the taxi driver of souls, but now with a clear purpose. He became a legendary figure in the city, feared by evildoers, respected by the living, and revered by the dead. São Paulo, a metropolis of millions, now had a secret guardian. And every night, A yellow taxi could be seen cruising its streets, transporting passengers between this world and the next, guided by a man who had stared into the abyss and returned to tell the tale. Years passed, and João became an almost mythical figure in São Paulo. His reputation grew both among the living and the dead. He was sought after by desperate people seeking contact with deceased loved ones and by spirits eager to resolve unfinished business. However, the balance João had achieved was about to be challenged. A series of supernatural events began to shake the city. Objects moving on their own, mass apparitions, and even reports of possessions. João realized that something was disturbing the barrier between worlds. His investigations led him to a terrible discovery. A group of occultists was trying to open a permanent portal between the realm of the living and the dead. The leader of this group was none other than Fernando, the long-lost son of Antonio Ferreira, Maria Luisa's murderer. Consumed by a desire for revenge against João for exposing his father, Fernando had spent years studying the dark arts. João found himself at the center of a supernatural battle for the soul of the city. On one side were he and his allies, including the spirit of Maria Luisa and others he had helped over the years. On the other side were Fernando and his cult, who planned to use the chaos from opening the portal to gain power in both the physical and spiritual worlds. The fight spread through the streets of São Paulo, with clashes occurring in places charged with history and supernatural energy. The Conceição Cemetery, the Sé Cathedral, and the abandoned Joelma building. João discovered that his unique connection to both worlds was crucial to stopping Fernando's plan. He could see and interact with the supernatural forces being summoned, while still maintaining his anchor in the physical world. The climax of the battle took place atop the Bainspa Tower on a stormy night. As Fernando performed the final ritual to open the portal, João led an eclectic group of living and dead allies in a desperate attack. At the height of the confrontation, João realized that the only way to close the portal was to sacrifice his own connection to the supernatural world, the very connection that had defined his life in recent years. In a moment of courage and selflessness, João plunged into the partially open portal, using his vital energy to seal it. The portal imploded, taking Fernando with it and dispersing the supernatural forces threatening the city. When the dust settled, João was found unconscious atop the tower. He survived, but his connection to the spirit world had been severed. He could no longer see or hear the dead. In the following months, João struggled to adapt to his new reality. He returned to being an ordinary taxi driver, though he carried with him the memories and lessons of his extraordinary experiences. However, João began to notice something curious. Though he could no longer see spirits, he still seemed to be guided by an invisible force. Passengers in need always seemed to find his taxi at the right moment. He developed an almost supernatural intuition for avoiding accidents and helping people in danger. João realized that even without his powers, he was still the taxi driver of souls. His compassion and desire to help others were his true strength, not his supernatural abilities. And so, João continued to roam the streets of São Paulo, a silent guardian, helping both the living and the dead in his own way. People still whispered stories about the legendary taxi driver who could speak to the dead, hardly knowing that he was still among them, fulfilling his duty in a different but equally important way. Meanwhile, in the dark corners between worlds, new threats were forming, waiting for the right moment to challenge the balance once again. Months after the confrontation at the Bainspa Tower, João continued his life as an ordinary taxi driver, believing his connection to the supernatural had ended. But on a rainy night, he picked up a passenger who would change everything, an elderly woman who seemed strangely familiar. During the ride, the woman revealed herself to be Maria Luisa, not the spirit João had known, but an aged version who had never died. The real Maria Luisa had escaped Antonio Ferreira's attack decades ago and had lived in hiding ever since. The spirit João had helped was a malevolent entity feeding on the suffering generated by guilt and the search for redemption. Horrified, João realized that all his efforts to help lost souls had, in fact, strengthened this entity. Each act of kindness had fed its influence over the living world. The J. Maria Luisa G in the back seat transformed, revealing her true form, a grotesque creature with multiple distorted faces of the souls she had deceived. She explained that the portal João believed he had closed was actually the final stage of an ancient ritual to permanently break the barrier between worlds. Desperate, João tried to flee, but found his taxi, now traversing a nightmarish version of São Paulo. Buildings twisted impossibly, streets were filled with wailing shadows, and the sky was a whirlpool of agonized faces. The creature revealed that João had been chosen from the start. His compassion and desire to help were the key to fully opening the portal. Each good deed performed with the earmark of sharing had been a hammer blow to the thin veil between worlds. In a last desperate act, João tried to crash the taxi into a wall, hoping to destroy the creature. But the impact only accelerated the process. The taxi transformed into a grotesque cocoon, merging with João and the entity. Days later, authorities found the abandoned taxi. There was no sign of João, only a dark stain on the driver's seat. In the following months, reports of sightings of a ghost taxi began to spread through the city. Passengers mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only whispers of regret and pain. The taxi, now an amalgamation of João, the entity, and all the souls they had helped, eternally roams the streets of São Paulo. It is a walking portal between worlds, collecting more souls and spreading suffering. The last vision is of a decrepit taxi stopping on a deserted street. The passenger window rolls down slowly, revealing a pulsating mass of agonized faces, with João's pleading eyes at the center, silently begging for release that will never come. And so, the legend of the taxi driver of souls gained a new and terrifying chapter, turning into a cautionary tale whispered on the dark nights of São Paulo. Beware of the taxi you take, for it might be your last ride.